This is House Planning Help, episode 399. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build or retrofit. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guests are Jon Broome and Nick Grant, co-authors of the Good Building book. They have decades of experience between them. Jon, he's an architect. He worked with Walter Seagull in his early career. Walter pioneered lightweight timber construction in self-building, making it much more accessible. So this set Jon off on a path, and he's supported co-ops, group self-build, community projects, and helped build sustainable neighbourhoods. Nick is a freelance energy consultant who's worked almost exclusively on Passive House projects since 2008. He's a founding member of the Passive House Trust and Co-Action, two great organisations. So often we plug a resource in this early part of the podcast, and it's an easy choice today. Of course, it's going to be the Good Building book. What is not so easy is maybe you'll forget to buy a copy, or you'll think, oh, I've heard the podcast about it, I don't need to get a copy. But I want to motivate you now to take action. So here are 3 reasons that you should get yourself a copy. You're going to learn a lot. Obviously, that is reason number 1. But if you're listening to this podcast, you're in the right place. These are all topics that we cover again and again, yet you're going to go into more detail here. It's a nice, logical path through it and lots of interesting examples. I'm banking that there will be sections of this book that bring new ideas to you, or maybe ideas that have been hazy before that you can just clarify. So this book is going to solidify your learning. And of course, you're supporting people doing great work. This hasn't just been knocked out. This has been in the offing for a few years, as we're going to hear in a moment. So well done, Jon and Nick, for making it happen. So let's get to our featured interview with them both. And they're well known in sustainable building circles. So I took the opportunity to source a few questions from social media, which I'm going to pepper into today's conversation. As they've both been on the podcast before and introduced themselves, I thought it might be interesting today to get them to introduce each other and explain their connection.
There's a pressure. Gosh, Jon, I don't remember when we first met, but probably a self-build. So had Jon's book, someone gave me many years ago, the first self-build book from a long time ago. It's a lovely brown book, and my partner and I were looking, we got a plot, we were looking to build. It was heady days, this is over 30 years ago. And this book, suddenly these ideas, and it was very empowering. So and then we met Brian Richardson, who was one of the authors who's lived fairly near us, and through him I think we met Jon. That seems a long time ago, and we've done a lot of things since. We haven't worked on many projects. We've done a couple of overseas jollies and various things, and we've always, been around each other. But so inspiration,
When I came across Nick, I was very impressed by this idea of having performance as a real important part of the whole business of building. And when I was writing about self-build, Nick's house was a prime example of quite a novel way of building with straw and so on. And we kind of went from there. And as Nick says, we've done 1 or 2 things since.
And when did you come up with the idea that you were going to work together on this book?
The original publisher rang me to see if I'd be interested in doing a book on water. And that was the publisher that did the Sustainable Energy Without Hot Air, David Mackay. And I said, I'm not really doing water anymore, but I think some sort of book on sustainable building without hot air. I was thinking sort of cut the bullshit type sustainable building. Then I thought it'd be nice to do that with Jon. And I think you probably there was a parallel approach to you as well at the same time.
Yes, there was a small group of people who know one another, swap ideas, and had the idea of bringing all that together. Very much sustainability in the broad sense, but also experience from building and designing. And the group met very occasionally over beer. Little progress was made initially, and then I approached the publisher of the Green Self-Build book, who was quite keen, and that went forward again very slowly. And really it was only when he sold up to Bloomsbury that it got serious and we had a contract for the first time.
Deadline.
So my take on the book is that it's pretty much all encompassing and you've put a lot in there. So where do you start with this? What are you trying to do with the book?
It's an attempt, I think, to bring experience over the years in many fields. There's lots of stuff that's useful and good and some that isn't. And it was an idea of trying to distill the sense out of greenery and come up with something practical and useful in how people design and build, really.
And this is something that fascinates me, this where you have a huge, great topic and you have to decide, well, firstly, how long do I want this to be? How do I break it up? How long are we going to give ourselves to work on this? How did you make all these decisions?
Early on, we said it's not going to be an encyclopedia of everything about building. We're not going to cover all the different standards. It was going to be very much from our personal experience. But we thought that could be broadened out. So we both got experience with self-build, and that's quite niche. But we thought we'll focus on that because we've got the experience and then see how that spreads out to wider than that. So people who might be procuring buildings, local public buildings and so on. So everyone has some involvement with buildings, even if they're not doing a self-build project. So we tried to sort of take our hands-on experience and see how that's relevant rather than delve into areas which we didn't know about. And just there was a bit of stuff we had to research and learn for the first time to put it in the books. We felt there's a hole in our knowledge. We want to learn this stuff. And it's like when you teach, that's how you learn stuff, because you got to learn it before you can teach it. So it was a bit of that. So some things in the book surprised us. We learnt them in researching it for the book and changed some of our thinking, I think. And also, this is like the book, I think we had the title ended up quite grand, the Good Building Book, but originally it was just a working title, and we're thinking, well, buildings are crap, and it's not difficult to say how to do it a bit better. We felt that wasn't too grand a task. We thought there's lots of things we can improve, like you mentioned, the performance. There's a whole range of stuff, and we started with that, and then the question of, well, what is a good building came up, which was a bit of a grander one, which slightly terrified us, but we've had a stab at it, haven't we?
Well, it's not just the Good Building Book, though, is it? You could say that you've avoided going for the best building in the world book. So why?
Well, we say, the best is the enemy of the good, isn't it?
Well, exactly. I mean, so many buildings which are awarded prizes and so on, in fact, turn out to not work terribly well at all in practice and in use. And I suppose one of the big things that I feel about this is a bit of a call to arms, really, about making sure that the users of buildings, the residents and so on, are respected and understood, and that they have a role to play in the design and construction and management of buildings as well, how they're looked after into the future in a sustainable way.
Now, why don't they? That would seem to the outsider, well, of course they're going to be the people inputting.
You would think that, and it's a continual conundrum to me as to why that isn't understood more widely, but it certainly isn't, I think, in the UK, more so perhaps on the continent, where there's a different culture, where collaboration is much more encouraged, I think, in this case, between professionals and building users, for instance.
But in some ways that approach runs through this whole book, that collaboration. But just staying here for a moment with these end users. So what would you suggest to someone who's perhaps coming into this cold? They could be across any building type. We normally talk homes here, but there's someone that does want to get involved. Are they being pushed out the way because it's going to slow things down, having too much collaboration, or what might be going on, or how do they get more involved?
Well, I think my own view is that there's a cultural problem in the UK about trust, that somehow ordinary people aren't trusted with expending public funds in a sensible way, with making decisions in a sensible way. And this is reflected in our approach to politics, I think. I mean, it's a very big issue, but it does play out in building, as in so many other fields of social understanding.
Now, I've got a few questions that I'm going to pepper in as we go along, but it would seem that this is a good point for the first one. So Martin Ingham has said, who is this book aimed at?
It's very hard just writing into the void. So I had in mind, well, first of all, it was the book I'd like to have had when I did my self-build. So we both made a lot of mistakes with our own builds and designs, and you kind of wish you'd known stuff, and you've done the expensive experiment, you've made the mistake. So there's some lessons and myths that would be nice. So we do a bit exploding some of those myths, so that would be useful. I think students, architecture students, other architects, and going back to the point you're just saying about the the client and the end user, there's some tokenism about designers having consultations and all this sort of thing. We could say, as designers, you should talk to the end users. But I think the powerful thing is if the end users get hold of this book and they understand a bit more about design and the process and what goes wrong, they're in a much more empowered position to question or to select the people they want to work with and that sort of thing. So I think for me, that's probably the most radical thing, giving people the tools and the confidence to challenge what they're being told or sold.
It's significant too, I think, that in the field of building and design, it wasn't that long ago that we had community architecture was a thing. We had a community architect running the RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, and we had a government, that was talking about encouraging new ways of thinking about housing in particular, which is what I was doing at the time. And somehow all that has been forgotten. It's been lost.
This is one of the challenges, isn't it? I thought at some point during this interview we could, because we've all built our own houses, and one interesting fact is that we've all stayed in these houses for quite some time. But it does depend a little bit where in time we are and how well we feel we have done at that time. So I thought it'd just be interesting to hear, are there any lessons or anything that you would do differently from your projects, and just talk about the era when you built your own house? Because I don't think last time we chatted, Jon, for example, we talked about your own home.
It's 30 years ago now. It was pretty different, I think, at the time to the way most people were thinking about building. It's tree trunks, it's all timber, and interestingly wouldn't pass building regulations these days. We were strapped for money, so it's double glazed, not triple. It's relatively modestly insulated and a very leaky building. We had very poor, and I wish I met Nick sooner. I think we'd have had a better hit on how to make the building airtight. The other thing which really strikes me these days is how inflexible most modern construction is. Unlike when we were working with Walter Siegel with an extremely simple, extremely economic way of building, which doesn't fulfill performance requirements of modern buildings by any means. Difficult to know how you could make it do so. But there were lessons to be learned from the simplicity and economy of that approach to building. And the flexibility of it, the fact that you can take walls down, move them, you can put windows and doors where you want without any structural problems. And so looking at this house now with its massive timber structure and so on, it's not flexible. And I think this is a very important aspect of building, which is often overlooked.
It's interesting hearing that. Also, some of the similar inspirations. We didn't do the Siegel method, but we were very much inspired by that. And Pat Board and Cindy Harris's book, Out of the Woods, was an inspiration about buildable things. And we were straw bale. We built a house out of which it was the rage at the time. If we hadn't been so slow, we might have been the first straw bale house in Britain, but we were very slow. But I suppose moving on from thinking it's not about just the materials or the sort of the novelties, it doesn't really matter so much what you build. It's how it's done that's more important. So we've too much focus on materials. Pattern language is something we mentioned in the book, and that's another inspiration for both of us, the timeless way of building stuff. And we're revisiting that and the Siegel and a lot of these ideas which were from a very long time ago. So they're in many ways really not relevant today. It's about little windows, single pane windows, lots of things we just wouldn't do now, but we're trying to think, what is the stuff that is timeless in that? What is the approach that you can apply to the situation today, modern economics, concerns about climate change, modern materials, and so on? So I think something through the book, we do start with a quote from 1970-something, that it feels like this stuff's been said for a long time, and why hasn't it moved on? That's interesting. I don't know if we are moving it on, but we're not claiming to invent anything new, I don't think, are we?
There's so much to be learned from the stuff that's been going on over that period, yeah.
And some of the things, if you mentioned vernacular or you mentioned pattern language, there will be, people will suddenly think, oh, you mean like Poundbury, or you mean certain things. And it's very hard to have a discussion. As soon as you mention one thing, people sort of jump on it with preconceived ideas. It's almost like you can't mention certain things. Or if you mention modern architecture in some circles, people immediately, that's horrible. It's really hard to have those open discussions and accept the good of everything and see why. So why doesn't that work? Can we change the bit that doesn't work, keep the bits we like? Trying to be quite agnostic about style as well, because we've all got different, Jon and I like similar things, but we accept that some people will like completely different stuff to us, and we're all different. And the book wasn't about how our buildings should look, but it's important how they look and feel.
What's interesting, the biggest takeaway from my own build is that I feel sad that I didn't do what both of you did, which is use more bio-based materials. And mine is a masonry cavity wall, but what it does do, it's passive house standard. It is, I think, a good form. We absolutely love it. The layout and all the rest of it. Hopefully there are lots of efficiencies. Our friend Alan Clark doing all the mechanical services and all these sorts of things. So while hopefully I got one big element right, it's funny how I didn't get that right, even though I should have completely known about it. And some of it was an intrigue thing. I wanted to understand, well, surely if most of our construction is like this, then let's bring up the performance. So where do we stand on materials at the moment?
As you say, personally, I love timber. I can't lay bricks for a start. But if someone wants to build out of bricks or mortar, we think that's fine. It's how you build, and there's other things that are more important. It's sufficiency as well, because it's like you can have a huge building that's full of bio-based materials and costs a fortune. And in the book, we do a bit of debunking of, you get some very, and that's probably going to upset some people. You get the sort of seemingly the perfect sustainable material, and you start doing some hard numbers. And if it's not affordable and it isn't something we can roll out, then is it really relevant? So this stuff has to be repeatable and relevant. And there is move to make quite radical bio-based stuff quite mainstream. So, it certainly can't be sort of hippies in the woods, going and cutting their own trees and hewing them with axes and stuff. I mean, it's fine if people want to do that, but it's not scalable, and we're not against that, but it's just not going to change the world.
Now, I have to say that was one of my favourite bits of the book, where you look at other buildings that have been celebrated by architecture. They've won lots of awards, yet when you start looking behind whether they fulfil their function, sometimes they don't at all. So does your little Venn diagram of function, aesthetics and cost feature as a very important part of this book?
It's a constant thing that comes up in design meetings, which I'm kind of often on the sort of functional side, trying to get the energy performance and working with the structural engineers. And there's often this conflict between a fixed idea about what this building has to look like, and that can, as you know, be in conflict. Someone's come up with this idea of some cantilever that sort of disappears or some weightlessness look, and that needs materials and upfront carbon, and it's expensive, and it's always sort of feel like I'm the Philistine who doesn't appreciate the aesthetic, trying to impose this sort of rational thing on it, and I don't like to be in that position. So the Venn diagram is quite interesting. We're quite, just as a tool, we had to make it three things. So it's around the original Firmitas, Utilitas, and help me, John.
Vitruvian,
Vitruvian principles, but economy wasn't in there. But we talk about what Vitruvius said on economy, which is incredibly up to date. But I think it's a useful tool. So we're not saying what a beautiful building looks like, because that's subjective. It might have to just meet planning. It might have to win architecture awards or win over funding. That's going to vary. But it's important. The economy is important. Even if it's a multi-million-pound project, it shouldn't go over budget. There's still economy is important. Economy also includes global economy and the material cost and resource efficiency and so on. And then function, again, that's going to vary over time. We're focused on performance, like you mentioned, passive house, so comfort and energy efficiency, but it's also fire, working as whatever the building. So the examples we use the example of archives in one chapter because it's kind of niche. It's something I've worked on a lot. But what's interesting about archives is they have a very clear performance requirement. That there's British standards, there's security, there's fire resistance, there's environmental conditions, there's cost to run, and then now we've got environmental requirements for carbon to run it and so on. So there's a lot of stuff you shouldn't be able to negotiate, very fixed in the brief. And when we look at these examples, a lot of them really are wanting. Now, we're not saying that, architects can't do buildings that are affordable, perform and everything. It's not like a rule of the universe that you can't have famous architecture that works, but we were struggling to find examples. A lot of the really lauded buildings just don't work, and they're expensive. So in terms of a Venn diagram, they just hit the aesthetics. You may not even like them, but they're ticking that box for enough people that they earn that place, but they just don't work and they're very expensive.
I think also what occurs to me is that presented with a building design problem question. There's an idea that most people are going to jump at some overarching vision, which is fine, but very often it doesn't go beyond that and becomes, uneconomic, unfunctional. The balance really is skewed towards what things look like rather than how they work. And I think it's just rebalancing that away from icons to, usable economic buildings.
Is that the trouble with the image as well, that the image is often how we first see a building? So doing something with an amazing cantilever captures our imagination, whereas perhaps we shouldn't be thinking like that straight away for lots of reasons that we're going to come on to as we work our way through this.
I think the question is whether it isn't possible to do an interesting, beautiful building which isn't also fulfilling its functional requirements adequately and is economic and sensible to build.
I think it's about where you start, isn't it? Because if you start with the functional layout, what it's got to do, the budget, all that boring stuff, and then at the end of it, you may, by some, just like vernacular, we talk about vernacular as a process, not as a style. At the end of that, it might be something that everyone really loves, or it might look a bit dull, and you think, oh, this needs something to lift it. And then you can think, well, what can we do to tweak it? But it's much harder to take a building that you look at it and go, wow, that's incredible, but it doesn't work. How can we stop the rain coming in? How can we stop it overheating? How can we make it, whatever it needs to do? That's much harder to add the performance. If you're retrofitting, you got a beautiful old cottage or modernist 1950s building and it's beautiful, but it hemorrhages heat, it's uncomfortable, very hard to retrofit it without messing up what we like about it. The thin steel glass frames and so on, they're all things which we think are beautiful, but very hard to make them nice. Whereas if you embrace the function, a different aesthetic emerges. But the aesthetics is important. We're not saying it doesn't matter. I mean, you look around John's house, it's all about aesthetics. It's beautiful, and it's about how the flow works, the function, everything else. It's not do one or the other, but it's where you start, I think.
Now, when you went through some of those examples in the book, I saw cork house there, which was quite interesting because it uses this lovely cork material. But I got a bit of a shock because I've visited this myself, and I often, I know I'm maybe not going to agree with everything people say, but sometimes just out of intrigue, I will go and find out that story. What's the cost? Did I misunderstand this, that you were saying that from some simple numbers, it's going to be about £22,000 per square metre? Have I got that right or wrong?
Come on, and we haven't approached them. The point there, we haven't given right to reply. The point was, we're just saying that just do some critical back of the envelope calculations. So cork is a magical material, but it is very expensive. It's very limited supply. The industry is looking for more, because people are not using cork in wine bottles anymore. They're looking for more outlets, but a wine bottle cork is a small thing. It's quite a high value product compared with big slabs of stuff to make an actual building out. So we're really just saying, question, rather than thinking this perfect sustainable thing, is it scalable? Is there enough in the world? Can you grow enough? Is it cost effective? And just really, it was just an example of what can you do without having the research. What can you do from your bedroom with access to the internet to check out if something is likely to be good? And we're happy for someone to come back and explain that cork is affordable and we can scale it and so on and so on. But we just put that out, and as we say in it, we're not wanting to pick on a team that have wanting to do the right thing. They want to be super sustainable, but it just seemed to be an example of something that's universally lauded as being, this is the perfect sustainable thing. So we're just asking those questions.
I mean, there are other examples, I think, in the book of similar sort of ideas which are necessary to look at in a more critical way about, you mentioned earlier, Ben, about large areas of south-facing glazing, for instance. There's this idea, northern hemisphere, face the sun, it'll heat your building for free. Unpick it, not true. Windows are, the most expensive way of heating a building that you can probably devise. And similarly, the whole business about carbon in construction is similarly fraught with all kinds of contradictions about how sequestering carbon in buildings is helpful. It doesn't work that way.
How many years do we need to get this? I'm thinking of the hangar at Duxford. I can't remember the award-winning architect, but just that thought that you're melting the planes because it gets so hot in there. When do we get the message, or are some people never going to get the message?
I suppose being allowed to call these things out, it feels quite scary. You're taking
well,
these
that's the one
famous
thing I
buildings that
really
people-
like about you. I said I had to put this in here somewhere that, that is good. You're just being honest in a world that's gone mad where sometimes we're wondering whether we're going to be able to speak honestly soon.
I'm personally a bit braced for the sort of angry response from. So
Have you had any?
Well, so far, so
Yeah,
can't.
well,
Maybe
I'm
this-
sorry if
maybe
this is
the-
the interview that does it.
This is the one. Someone's just probably the angry ones probably write themselves. They probably come out quite quick, but someone probably somewhere is fuming. But we've had. I mean, the PDF before it was the hard copy was sent out to partly for feedback and partly for the marketing, but we sent it to quite a wide range of people we respect, but also as architectural academics, self-build people, engineers, architects, designers, TV people. So we sent it to a range of people, and they clearly read it from the feedback.
It's surprisingly, unremittingly supportive, really, of the ideas, which, we're waiting for, the critical analysis of some of this, because, there's lots of different ways of viewing these things, I think.
Now, I think it's time to interject another question here just before we move too far away from this, because earlier on you mentioned sufficiency. So our friend George McKercheek has said, in the grand scheme of things, do you feel that sufficiency trumps efficiency?
George, that's it. We'll just step back a bit. I mean, case studies is the thing. You think of book on good buildings. Let's list our 10 good buildings. And it's very hard. So George's house, which you've covered it on the podcast, we've done videos there. It's one of my favourite buildings. As soon as you pick that as, say, a case study and say, this is it, but people say, but it's not in an urban setting, but it's single story, but it's, and what's interesting, most buildings, there's always something that doesn't fit for everyone. So, but what's very good with George is it is very sufficient. It's very modest. And there was a Grand Designs episode, I think we mentioned it in the book. There were 2 episodes of Grand Designs. One was this, it's dangerous if I say in the square meterage even, it'll sort of be identifiable, but a very large, and it was passed to a passive house stand. Now, as we teach passive house, and that's one of the things. Again, it's something we almost didn't dare mention in the book. Do we use the word passive house, or is it going to alienate half our architecture audience? But we mention it, and we're a bit critical of it as well, and we're open to criticism on it. But you get the idea of the 800 square metre, very low energy passive house with solar panels over the roof that's enough to power the village, versus a fairly modest small building. Now, in terms of environmental concerns and scalability and everything else, it's the modest, small, sufficient building, whatever it is, whether it's a public building you're building or whether it's your self-build. Not that, if people do a mansion, great, they do it efficiently and stick some PV on the roof and spend their money on that, but there's something about claiming that is environmental somehow, I think is the problem. When I had less money, I was much more environmental. Now I've earned a bit of money, and you buy stuff and you spend stuff and you don't think twice about taking the train or travelling distances. So yeah, sufficiency is key. You can never do enough efficiency to compensate for just the more and more of everything.
Now, I noticed that you've got 4 sections in this book. It starts off with design, and then you progress on to efficiency, then move into the materials and all the rest of it. So how did you decide these 4 sections and what would go into them, why they make 4 good sections?
I suppose we were conscious of the idea that building is one part of a bigger process, which involves designing for sure, and the materials coming together in a certain way and the performance of buildings, but also the context within which you're working in terms of the culture and politics, so that we felt it was important to include issues around contractual arrangements, which have had a devastating effect on the building industry, really, in terms of the way that responsibility is being handed down through subcontracting, through design and build. And the culture of quality and taking responsibility for construction is a long way down the line these days in terms of priorities. And I think, rebalancing again the need for a more quality-focused attitude is really important. And it goes through design education, it goes through the unhelpful culture, in my view, of overemphasis on risk and risk management and how you deal with that, and regulation, and how important it is to get the balance there right. I don't think that it is at the moment at all correct in planning or building safety terms. So it's a whole area which I think gets overlooked in discussions about sustainability and design of buildings is the processes involved in actually creating them.
Because architecture's interesting in terms of education. Did you do 7 years degree?
I did. It's far too long. I mean, do it in 2 or 3 if you have to. There's not nearly enough practical component, I think, of most design education courses. And we talk about how one might refocus design education to create a more balanced view of building.
And how do you think architecture courses are today, if that's something you know about? Have they changed hugely from when you did yours?
Massively, because most, I think it's fair to say, probably don't emphasise structure and construction and environmental performance. The focus is very much more on, crazy visions, buildings as sculpture, as I think we remark on a remark that Pat Borer made some years ago, and very apposite, I think it is.
Let's move on. We've mentioned Passive House a couple of times, and I have a message from Graham McKay from Misfits Architecture. And he says, "Hello, Ben. My question became a message. First, congratulations to Jon and yourself for getting this book out there. I learned a lot. Who'd have thought a wall has better thermal performance than any high-spec window unit? I didn't, so I reduced the area of glazing in a small house I'm currently designing for my father. He lives in Australia in Perth, where winters are mild and rainy and summers are hot and dry. In summer, my mother, who was born in Sheffield, used to insist on keeping the windows shut until either the cooling sea breeze arrived or the sun went down. She didn't understand the science, but it was the right thing to do. These days, we'd call this vernacular intelligence. Nick, my question is this. Passive house design can get us so far, but how do you think we could go about getting people to pay more attention to how to operate their houses for maximum comfort?
Oh, Graham, hello. Braced for your feedback. Big fan of your blog, the Misfits Architecture blog, as you know, and we quote you a few times in the book. One of the criticisms of Passive House, it doesn't include loads of things like materials and maybe the operation of the building and so on. But it really does one thing and does it well. It looks at comfort and performance and it gives us some tools. And with a different house, we were in a board meeting or another technical panel meeting yesterday of Passive House people, and we were all there able to be in a safe environment with Chatham House rules. We can be very critical, so we can question the things that don't work or things that are too difficult or too techy and so on. So hopefully in the book we get across that Passive House just gives us these tools. It isn't the be-all and end-all. One thing, though, with Passive House is if we get it right, the building's a lot easier. I mean, some people have, like with passive solar back in the day, you had to shut the shutters at night, you had to vent and do all sorts of complicated things. You had to make sure the rock store or the water store is up to temperature and the house wasn't controlling things. So the thing with Passive House, and Ben lives in one, I don't live in a Passive House, I live in a pretty low energy building, but lots of friends who live in Passive Houses now, it's actually very easy. So I think it shouldn't be difficult to live in a building. Now, if we've got existing buildings, Bill Bordas, who big fan of, he wrote a piece on building like sailing or something. So he was talking about what do we do with existing buildings that are very difficult to retrofit. And there was a lot about how we can work with the building, and it does take more effort. And it might be changing our clothing levels and using shading and all sorts of things, wall hangings in medieval castles and things. There's all sorts of things you can do or adapt. So that's very much about hands-on working with the building. But with Passive House, I think the thing is if you can do that, and it's particularly for new builds, we feel like you can do it for the same money and the same, less carbon, and it's a win-win thing. And then it's actually easy to run. So probably a bit of a jumbled answer, but I think if they design the building well, it's not that the people are irrelevant, it's just they don't have to, we can't blame the users for, if the building doesn't perform, we can't blame them for not running the building properly.
What would you say the direction of travel with Passive House? That's obviously, you mention it a fair few times, particularly in this efficiency section, but what's the direction of travel of Passive House at the moment, and how might this section help?
I think we've got to separate. So there's, like a lot of your audience, detached self-builds. It feels like a no-brainer to use most of the stuff. It kind of works. Small, like it's bungalows, detached dwellings, it feels like the energy target is just a little bit too hard. You can end up with very thick walls. And now we've got heat pumps and we've got a decarbonised grid. The original heating targets are probably just, if we just relax that a little bit, it suddenly becomes really easy. Once you get onto flats and so on, then that's not an issue. The form factor does the work. We can be talking the book. The heat loss isn't the big thing. The problem is, how do you ventilate flats when you've got noise and fumes outside? So you need to do control mechanical ventilation. How do you get hot water around the building without causing overheating? These aren't passive house challenges. These are just building challenges. So I think, whether it's new build, retrofit, detached dwellings, or blocks of flats, and domestic or non-domestic, these are all different problems, and passive house will address all of them, but I think there's different problems with each of them, if that makes sense. So for the detached domestic dwelling, I think it's sort of under 100 square meters, and particularly if it has to be a bungalow, it feels like we need to relax the targets. You can, George's house, it's full passive house, it is a small detached bungalow, but he's got thick walls, and that's fine. But if we want to scale this, it's probably, his heating bills are almost nothing. So we could have, 10% more than nothing, and it would be fine. Because you've got other costs as well, like hot water and travel and lighting and so on. So we are just focusing on the heat. But I think for new build, it's really good to get it right.
I think one of the other things to bear in mind always in this sort of discussion is the idea that we inherit an awful lot from the previous generations. And so, people brought up in Victorian houses with very little insulation, open fires and so on. There was a different way of approaching all these questions about ventilation, heating, and it's difficult to unlearn that stuff. And there are many other aspects of, people want an easy life for sure. Maintenance of modern buildings is a bit of an issue very often. Going back to that brick terrace house, a lot of it is very robust in terms of how it lasts. They're 150 years old and still standing and still used. Whereas a lot of modern construction is much less robust very often. And the maintenance implications of big buildings in particular are huge.
And I wanted to talk a little bit about making those good decisions at the beginning. I can't remember whether we've mentioned value engineering within this conversation already, but that's one of the things, Nick, that you've really tried to share with people throughout your career, isn't it? So what is this business of making the good decisions up front rather than further on in the construction process?
I'm very unqualified. I dropped out of 2 universities. I was originally studying engineering design. I've been self-taught and making it up as I go along ever since. But when I was taught design, it was really, and even as a kid just making stuff, it was really starting from the inside out, trying to problem solving. And Graham, you're going back to Graham, his approach to architecture is very much that. You've got a problem here. Just the layout, and how do you use the size of the plot, and how do you deliver the things you need to do, privacy, circulation, views, all the stuff. For me, design is about that. And then the form follows from it. And if you do that, then you're working with constraints, and one of the constraints is the cost, the budget, the materials, the plot size. These are all constraints. And if you design like that, then this happens automatically. That's, for me, how design works. Now, it was a surprise to me coming into the building world. As Jon said before, people draw a shape, and then other people have to work out how you actually build it. How do you make it perform? How do you make it meet regs? How do you make it meet fire regulations? How do you get escape distance? All the stuff that's important. People have to solve these problems, which are the making of that initial sketch. Whereas if you start with solving the problems and then the design emerges, and then you get surprised by the shape and stuff comes out of that process rather than starting with the shape and working back. So I think, it's the process. So the value engineering just gets baked in. It's not something you can do at the end. You can't do any of this stuff at the end. It's got to be baked in.
And so much of this is doing more with less, isn't it? That's one fundamental that I absolutely love, and it doesn't just apply to the form.
It's about the process, as Nick says. Rather than just jumping in at the outset and making a shape and then trying to fit everything else into it, I see it much more as a kind of circular process where issues of structure and performance and cost are fed in at various stages of elaboration of the final building, which is a complicated thing, but you can't just start with a scribble on a pad and work from that. You've got to be aware of all those constraints that Nick talks about and feed them in progressively in more and more detail until you come out with something that is, one hopes, a good building, that it's functional and economic and beautiful thing to live in, work in, whatever.
I was going to say, it's a fun process. I mean, that's the thing that shocked me when someone started spitting feathers about the term value engineering. They meant cost cutting. You would run out of budget. A building would be designed too difficult to build. Once the prices came in, it wasn't achievable. So we had to have plastic windows, not wood. We had to use cheap paints, and we had to get rid of all the nice stuff, use PVC flooring, not nice lino. So all the nice stuff had to go, and that's cost cutting. It's not value engineering. But when you do genuine value engineering, just a meeting in Bath with some engineers a few weeks ago, and it was just about 4 or 5 of us sat around. There was a fire engineer, the QS was there on the call, the M&E, the architect, structural engineer, and we just sat around like a bunch of friends trying to solve a problem. And we knocked millions off the cost of the building, and it got better, and the performance improved, and it was going to be more buildable, all within a couple of hours. And it was face-to-face. It's very difficult doing this stuff on Teams. It's great we don't have to travel the length of the country just to sit in a meeting and do nothing, but sometimes this stuff, it is round the water cooler, it's bits of paper and scribbling stuff and daring to say something in a safe environment. How about, I'm not an engineer, but how about this, would that? And then people say, oh yeah, that's great. Those things, that's kind of fun.
And I would add to that when you start involving building users in that process, it gets even more fun because it's very satisfactory, I think, because you end up with a two-way learning process. The designers are learning from what people's expectations, wants and needs are, and vice versa. They are able to understand what some of the constraints around building are in terms of fire and how you achieve economy and so on. And so it's getting that two-way process going. And the problem-solving approach, Nick, that you're talking about is about getting professionals doing a genuine two-way learning process, one from another. But crucially, in my view, you've got to get users in that conversation.
I know that Russ is one project that you've been really proud of and been involved with over the years in one way or another.
Indeed.
So this is something that I came to interview you about a few years ago. I don't know how many years ago, but maybe you want to tell us a little bit about that project. And now we've come out the other side. There are so many things going on there, and we've interviewed Kareem before, who I know, classic case of someone making something happen, but this extended journey of a community build and where it takes you, took its toll a little bit, but the finished community is just fantastic.
Yes, and I think critically we started from getting that learning process going. So the first thing that we did was have weekend workshop sessions. What are the aims of this project? And it often isn't very clearly stated before people start scribbling. Whereas the idea was to establish the principles which would then guide the whole process, provide those constraints, but heading in a good direction that everybody agreed was where they wanted to be. So the aim was what was a sustainable neighbourhood going to look like? There weren't really any examples in the UK that you could point to. We haven't created the answer, but we've moved in that direction and learnt a lot, I think, about how one could achieve a much better neighbourhood base. And it's all to do with the role that people played in that process. So going from big ideas about what the principles were, it then moved on to how you actually then turn that into something you could build, live in, pay for, get funding for. And the group of people we were working with were chosen by ballot in the end. I mean, we had, I think, probably 1,200 members, but we only had a limited number of dwellings within the budget. So we probably ended up with a group of about 50 people who met on a 2-weekly cycle, discussing the various aspects of what this neighbourhood might be in terms of how the building's set in the landscape, something which, again, is very often, I think, overlooked in architectural circles, it's the space in between buildings rather than the buildings themselves very often which make a place. And through that process, right the way through the construction, some of the people were able to take a shell, design their own layouts, and then go on and build them, learning, skills and getting a great deal of satisfaction from the process of actually designing their own place and then building it. And now that same group of people is managing it, they're improving it, they're landscaping it, and everybody's feeling very good about the whole process.
It affects how you feel and how you interact. You've had all that through the process, and as you say, they just keep going. They've done it on the building, so how can we make this place better?
Yes, and now we're looking at another site across the road, which is going to be even more challenging, I think.
You can't say even more challenging than that.
Yeah, we've got a Grade 2 listed swimming pool, which is more or less a ruin, which the idea is to create a community facility, along with some new housing and a nursery and other facilities.
Wow. I just wanted to talk about affordable housing, because you have this community land trust that's going on there that just seems as if it should be more widely known about. So are there any barriers there?
Yes, I think it comes back to this cultural issue about trusting people to organise themselves effectively. And the thing about a community land trust is it takes land out of the open market, which is crucial in the whole question of achieving affordability in where we live. The ownership of land in the UK is uniquely concentrated in the hands of the few. I think it's something like 99% of the population occupy 5% of the space. And that's reflected in accessibility to land to build in this way and the cost of doing so. The other important thing I think about the community land trust idea is that land is held in common, in trust, and the right to live there is pegged in order to take dwellings out of the private open market. So the idea is to retain affordability into the future, which, is a mechanism which we hope is going to become a bit more prevalent.
Well, exactly. This is what I was saying, that it's a good idea, isn't it, is my bottom line.
Go against the driver. What you do get the opposite thing is someone's got a plot and then they're advised by their planning consultant to put a 5-bedroom house on to maximise the value of the plot, because that's what you can get away with planning. They don't want a 5-bedroom house, but they kind of got to do it. It makes economic sense. And then that's unaffordable thing. So we've kind of got the economic drivers to the exact opposite of what is affordable and sustainable. And also investing, we've bought a bit of very cheap land. We were very lucky a long time. We built a house on it. Now we're sort of owners of property. And, I disagree with it, but we needed somewhere to live and we needed a bit of space for a workshop, and you grab it if you can, but it's not scalable, and it's not, you can't, other people say, I'd love to do that. And you say, well, you've got to be lucky, right place, right time, or have inherited money or something, which we hadn't. So it's very hard to see how, none of that. It would be nice to find a way this could just become normal.
I think one of the ways I see it is that an open market in houses and land is fine, and the alternatives aren't for everyone. The idea of a more common collaborative way of occupying and making space and so on. But on the other hand, it is a necessary part, I think, of any comprehensive policy about housing, that you need the alternatives, because the market doesn't supply what a lot of people want or need. And we need more alternative arrangements, community land trusts, co-housing, cooperatives, whatever, self-build. It's not for everyone, but there's a significant number of people who would absolutely jump at the chance if they could get somewhere to build.
And why this imbalance? Because if you head into Europe, often the statistics are completely different.
And I think, again, it's a cultural thing to some extent, that there is a much more collaborative approach. The question of public land, for instance, elsewhere on the continent is seen as a public good which is available on a competition of project rather than money. So, the social value is the thing which will make you get access to land rather than financial value.
Now, we haven't mentioned the book name in a while, so I'll mention it again, the Good Building Book. What do you want people to do having consumed this? They read this book, and having done it myself, there's a lot that you cover. You do cover it all, but what do we do with that at the end?
It would be interesting. Real examples may come in as people read it. I mean, an early one, some feedback from someone, they said, read the book, we got rid of our architect, we're looking for a new one. So, I hope it's useful for people. I hope it inspires people. A lot of friends who studied architecture who felt really, they were passionate about houses and building, and then they went to architecture school and it wasn't what they thought, and they felt like outsiders. They wanted something very different, and hopefully some of those will find something useful in this.
Is part of the challenge that you learn about building along the way? We've said what an amazing journey it is, and this is true for me too, but you do learn along the way. So is there any way to get a better foundation before you set off? I know the reverse can happen, that you can get stuck in this research forever mode.
Speaking of someone who's done that.
Well, I think visiting places and talking to people is essential in the sort of educational way, finding out. That applies in colleges and courses of design as well, I think.
Learning from mistakes. I mean, that's why there are some debunking in our book of things that we're pretty, still being done, like the passive solar thing. You read that chapter, it's still people sort of are doing it. We were doing it. I was doing this in early projects. We were sort of, adding more glazing to try and get the energy consumption to hit a certain target. And then you kind of step back and suddenly the scales fall away. It's expensive learning lessons on the buildings, and especially if it's other people's money, because it's often other people's money if you're a designer or developer or whatever. Learn from mistakes that have already been made. I wish we'd known some of the stuff there.
And you talk about, at some point, watching out for the word innovation in a brief. So maybe you could explain that one.
Yeah, innovation. It's interesting because innovation happens. Again, it's a bit like good design happens. If it happens out of you solving problems, then great. Suddenly we've got a new way of solving some world problem, whatever it is. That's an innovation. But the problem is when you set out to be innovative, and your planning might require, or your BREEAM points, this building must be innovative, and you start doing innovation for innovation's sake, and that just ends up being generally crap.
I mean, Walter Siegel had a point of view as well, which was designers have a duty not to use their clients' money for their own satisfaction and their own ego, which I think is something that designers should take a little bit more seriously generally, actually.
Are there any other pitfalls that might be worth mentioning that you've wanted to highlight in this book?
John, you mentioned principles with the CLT and so on. It's a bit like value engineering and cost. They've kind of taken on a different meaning. So people seem to think of, like, we talk about passive house principles as being like watered down. You just take some of the flavour of passive house, whereas principles should be the real key. What is it we're trying to achieve here? Is it comfort, affordability, low impact? What are the actual principles? And that is the bit we should reclaim. What are we actually trying to do? We're not trying to achieve passive house or BREEAM points, whatever. What we're trying to achieve, buildings that work, and what are the key things we want to do? And passive house is a way we think at the moment seems to have some tools to get us there for certain aspects. Other things it doesn't. It doesn't tell you anything about how you lay out your house or how you choose your paint colours or your materials. There's other ways of doing that, but what are we trying to achieve? That's key, not tick box. So we don't want to get into a tick box approach. Whatever the latest thing is, net zero carbon or whatever, or passive house, we're not trying to tick the box. It's just a tool to get to somewhere. So I think constantly questioning what are we trying to achieve, that's key. And it'll be different for different buildings in different climates and different people. And that's not some sort of cultural relativism. It's just stuff is different.
And one thing I wanted to ask you, Nick, was about this idea of starting from a box and whether you should be ashamed about that. Why does it make sense if other people are perhaps questioning that? What's the logic?
Yeah, no, again, that's a criticism. So, it's just got to be a box. But often, the house that a kid draws, if it's a small thing, you've got to put the door somewhere, and the rooms at the front need a window each. You haven't got room for 2 windows, so you end up with 4 windows and a door. And you see that all over the country. Houses of a certain size, you almost can't do anything else. You could move things around, but almost anything you do will make it worse. But George, who mentioned his project's interesting, he started off with a simple box, but then he moved one of the walls back, and he knew it was making it more complicated, but he needed a bit more width at one end of the building to fit in the bedroom and so on. The other end, he didn't need the width, but it was quite nice to have more of a veranda and covered area. So it wasn't like he thought, I need to make it look more crazy shape. It just came out of that process, and it works really well. If he'd made it into a rectangle, he'd have had a bigger house than he needed and more space that he couldn't really use. It wasn't space that he could add another room or make into a spare room. It was just a wider living room that didn't really need. So, it's not that the box is always the answer, but it's often it's a common solution to, if you've got finite space, best use of a space.
And is a good building something that you can read for these reasons?
Well, I think, Ben, you touched on it earlier. The initial impact of a building is what it looks like as you move around the town or the city. And the culture of building is, I believe, a bit underdeveloped in this country. People do not genuinely understand, how buildings perform and all the things we've talked about. And I think this is a bit of a problem, actually, that people are always amazed when you start talking about the process of actually getting a building built in terms of, the regulation, planning and all these other things. It is a very complex process. I mean, unnecessarily so very often. And I think that's one of the underlying kind of things behind what we were getting at in the book, that keep it simple.
I hope we've mentioned that word enough today. Do you think we have? I don't know.
What we do get into a bit is it doesn't have to look simple. So you're saying a box sounds like a boring box. Sometimes the box, and it comes back to decoration. So there's been an idea. We quite like minimalist thing. I don't like ornamental design generally, but there's something about, if you abandon all ornament, then you end up, the actual shape of the building becomes the ornament. So you end up with the crazy shapes trying to be sculptural. Whereas if you have a simple box, but you've got some nice details, some nice materials. Now, if it's a small building, just the texture of the render or the cladding is maybe enough to make it look lovely. You maybe do a coloured window reveal or something. Again, not everyone, to suit whatever you like. And that might be enough. You get a very big building, it's suddenly you're faced with this thing that's a big monolith of cladding, and you suddenly think, oh, we've got to do something. And that's when it needs creative solutions to solve the visual impact. But it could be trees and sculpture outside. It could be stuff that's nothing to do with the building. It doesn't have to be all about the building, does it? I mean, it could be people's stuff and decoration.
Yes, I mean, I do think, that space between and around buildings is extremely important. I mean, it's how we actually understand towns and cities, and the landscape too, for that matter. There's too much focus on buildings as an object and not a process. And I think, again, that's one of the underlying ideas is that we're talking about an active process rather than creating objects. And that's why it's so important, I think, that people get involved, because, it is a process that involves them one way or another, for good or bad.
Is there anything else that you feel should fit into this conversation today? I've tried to take us through some of the main themes as I have seen it, but are there any other aspects that perhaps I've missed out?
I mean, having written it, John, you just read, you sent me a copy of Slow Burn City by Ryan Moore. Fantastic. And suddenly, that's the danger. You've got the book out there finally after these 10 years of slogging away, and suddenly there's whole chapters that you think, it point to other people's work. And I just realised we say nothing about water efficiency. I spent like 10 years of my life on water efficiency and plumbing design and stuff, and we don't even touch some of this stuff. I think, I've kind of done that. It's out there. So I think what we hope we've done is there's some, again, it's the principles, some sort of, hopefully it's not going to be comprehensive, it won't be everything, but hopefully the approach is the bit that you can apply, trying to make the book a little bit timeless, so things will go out of date. As we say in there, maybe by the time this has reached print, Passive House turned out to be completely rubbish, even though we've been doing it for 30 years. But, we want the things in there, you can say, well, that was that, but the essence is right, the principles are still valid. Can be applied.
Yes, I think that's right. It comes back to underlying issues that run through the whole process, really.
Well, I think you've done a fantastic job on the book, and I particularly enjoyed seeing so many places that I've visited before and bits of conversations that I feel I've had elsewhere at conferences or in podcasts. So it just felt, oh my goodness, I know a lot of this. I'm sure there's loads more I don't know, but I feel you've hit on all the major areas. So well done. Jon and Nick, thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you.
Thanks.
Get more in our show notes today, which you'll find online at houseplanninghelp.com/399. You can review the key points in our summary. Also, we've added a few photos from some of the projects that we have been talking about today. And most importantly, buy your copy of the Good Building Book. We'll give you the links you need. Maybe you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question. Well, we'll point you in the direction of social media. Find all of that at houseplanninghelp.com/399. Just a couple of things as we finish up today. Firstly, a review of the podcast. These are very handy on whatever app you're using because it points people back to us. It's a bit like you create the tractor beam and send people back to the mothership. This one is from Robble and it says, I have just finished listening to most of the back catalogue and have gained an absolutely enormous amount of knowledge from this podcast. We're currently in planning for a passive house replacement dwelling, and this podcast has been the foundation of all my learning, both directly and through its links to detailed resources, companies and organisations. I'd expect a podcast of this quality to be US focused, so I couldn't believe my luck when I came across this one and discovered how relevant and comprehensive it is to UK self-builders and renovators who are focusing on high-quality, energy-efficient buildings. Love the work. Keep it up, Ben. Thank you for that. That's fantastic. So you can make it a short review, long review, whatever you fancy. Just try and sum up what we do on the podcast. And actually, on that note, I have some news that change is in the air. So we've got one more episode. When we get to episode 400, things are going to change. I'll explain why we're closing a chapter. I'm going to regroup and heading off in a slightly different direction. More will be explained in due course. Next time, Bill Butcher and Chris Herring are my guests. They're the founders of Green Building Store, which then became 21 Degrees. And I'm really excited for them because they're working on their own project. And we're going to delve into the details. It's all the things we like. They're keeping it simple. They're trying to keep it affordable. And they're going to be neighbours soon. Thank you so much for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.